Algebra students, in this video today we're going to be learning how to solve absolute value inequalities. Now remember, we have just learned recently how to solve absolute value equations. Now we are dealing with inequalities, so there is a difference, okay? We've learned how to solve these. We're going to learn how to solve these today, alright? Please copy down your heading, Solving Absolute Value Inequalities. Be sure and write down the lesson number 6.4 part 2, and be sure and include today's date, alright? Solving Absolute Value Inequalities, lesson 6.4 part 2, and be sure and include today's date. Now, first let's start off by seeing what an absolute value inequality looks like, and let's compare it to an absolute value equation, okay? It's always helpful to at least look at or understand what the inequality or equation is going to look like, alright? So here we go. Now remember, in the past we learned that an absolute value equation would be something like this, where you have a variable, a letter, a variable inside of an absolute value, and you have an equal sign. That's going to basically give you an absolute value equation. Got it? So you can kind of take notes on this however you want to. I'm just going to ramble for a little bit, and you can copy down what you feel you need to copy down. So the only difference now between an equation, an absolute value equation, and an absolute value inequality is simply this problem here would have a greater than sign or a less than sign. And it might have this line right here. It might not have that line right there. And that's it, guys. That's the only difference between an absolute value equation and an absolute value inequality. The absolute value equation will have an equal sign, and the absolute value inequality will have an inequality symbol. And that's it, guys. Pretty simple. And I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, now, just like when I taught you how to solve absolute value equations, I want to appeal a little bit, to a little bit of your common sense and talk to you about some exceptions to the usual types of absolute value inequalities, okay? So, here we go. Let me go back a page, and here we go. Now remember, just listen for a second, take some good notes and listen. Actually, first of all, do not write this down, just listen. Remember, in our previous videos, we learned that if you had an absolute value equation equal to 0, you would have one solution. If you had absolute value equation, absolute value set equal to a negative number, your answer was no solution. We learned that in video 6.4 part 1. So these are called exceptions. These are not your normal equations. Well, with inequalities, we have the exact same thing. With absolute value inequalities, we have some exceptions. There are actually more of them, and they're more difficult. So you're really going to have to pay attention, okay? But we have 4 exceptions, or unusual situations, if you will, to deal with when you're dealing with absolute value inequalities. Here's the first one. If I have an absolute value inequality, copy this down, please, and it's less than 0. If I have an absolute value inequality and it's less than 0, my answer will always be no solution. Now, some of you understand why and some of you don't, but everyone can memorize that. Here's why. I don't care what number you put in for x, you can put in negative 1 million for x. Okay, it doesn't matter. Whatever number you put in for x, and then multiply it by 2, and then subtract 3 when you're all done. Doing all of that, the last thing you're going to do is take the absolute value of it. So you will always get out a positive number. So you will never get a number less than 0, because all numbers less than 0 are negative. So that is impossible. It's impossible to solve this. Now, some of you understand why, some of you don't, but everyone can memorize this. When you have an absolute value set less than 0, your answer will always be no solution. Now, let's say you have an absolute value that is less than or equal to 0. That equals makes a big difference. Then your answer would simply be 0. Alright? Actually, that's not true. It would not be 0. I apologize. It would be this right here. You take your insides and you set it equal to 0. So whatever is inside your absolute value, you set it equal to 0, and you solve. And that would be your answer. You've got to take notes on this somehow. You've got to listen to me ramble and pause the video and take notes on this so you know what to do in all these situations. So far I've told you what to do when an absolute value is less than 0. It's no solution. When it's less than or equal to 0, you take whatever's on the inside of the absolute value, you set it equal to 0, and you solve. And that's your answer. Okay? Now if this would have had an equal sign here, less than or equal to, then we take 2x minus 3. Set it equal to 0. Bring your 3 over, make it positive, divide both sides by 2, and your answer would be 3/2. It would not be no solution because you had an equal sign here. Okay? So anytime it's less than or equal to 0, then you take the inside, set it equal to 0, and solve, and that's your answer. If it's just less than 0, then the answer is no solution. Please memorize these. Okay, there's 2 more scenarios. Here's the next one. If I have an absolute value that is greater than 0, okay, greater than 0, then my answer will simply be, are you ready? X is greater than 0. You can memorize that. That's your answer every time. If you have an absolute value, that is greater than 0, then your answer would be not this. I'm not sure why I put that. That's incorrect. Sorry. That is not right. I apologize. Your answer would be all real numbers. Except take your inside and set it equal to 0 and solve. Bring your 6 over and make it positive. So your answer would be all real numbers except 6. All real numbers except 6. So you've got to write that down. You've got to learn that. You've got to memorize that. If it says an absolute value is greater than 0, then your answer is going to be all real numbers except one number. And that one number is taking the inside of this, setting it equal to 0, and solving it. Alright? Okay, moving on to the last exception. And the last exception is pretty easy. Let's say you have something like 3x plus 7. The absolute value of 3x plus 7 is greater than or equal to 0. Then your answer would simply be all real numbers. Period. That's it. Doesn't matter. Because think about it, guys. Anything you put in for x is either going to come out 0 or positive. So it's all real numbers. Now look, you've got to learn these. Okay, it's your job to look at this, understand it, look at this, understand it. Take really good notes so you understand each scenario and what the answer would be. Alright, moving on. Now, having gone over those exceptions, please write down this next sentence. It is very, very important. Copy this down. I'm going to move on quickly, so you'll have to pause the video. Other than the exceptions that were just given to you, how many were there? 4. Other than those 4 exceptions, you will always have a conjunction for your answer or a disjunction for your answer when you solve an absolute value inequality. So throughout this lesson today, as I'm going over these notes, and teaching you every single answer that you get out when you solve an absolute value inequality, it's going to be either a conjunction or a disjunction, always, unless it's one of your 4 exceptions. Alright, so here we go. Here are the steps that you need for solving absolute value equations. Alright, I'm going to put these up here pretty quickly, and I'm going to move on, so you'll have to pause the video, okay? You first isolate the absolute value, just like you did for absolute value equations. Next, you decide if you have one of the special situations, and you answer accordingly. Step 3, write the 2 inequalities and decide whether you have a conjunction or a disjunction. I'll explain how to do that. And then solve either the conjunction or disjunction. I will walk you through each of these steps, okay? Are you ready? Please take some great notes. Here we go. Alright, let's solve this absolute value inequality. Okay, here we go. Step 1, isolate the absolute value. It's already isolated for you. We're good. Step 2, decide if it has one of your special situations. Well, let's pull our special situations down here so we have that page. Let's pull it down here somewhere so we can go back to it when we need to. There we go. Alright, so step 1, isolate the absolute value. That's done. Step 2, check and see if you have one of your special 4 exceptions. We do not, because all of them involve having a what right here? A 0, correct? So if we don't have a 0 here, then we're okay. Now remember, like I said in the previous video, when you're solving absolute value equations, also when you're solving absolute value inequalities, you must do the steps in order. You must do them in order. If you don't, you will mess up, okay? Alright, here we go. Now, step 3 says decide whether or not you have write your 2 inequalities and decide whether or not you have a conjunction or a disjunction. Listen carefully. Anytime you have an absolute value less than, it's going to be a conjunction. Always. I would write that down somewhere in your notes. Anytime you have an absolute value that is a less than a number, it's going to be a conjunction. So you write your x minus 4 right in the middle without the bars. You bring down your less than your 3. Then over here, you write less than again, and you put a negative 3. So whatever this number is here, you change the sign and you put it here. Got it? And you bring over your less than arrow there. Okay, let's go over this again. Step 3 says to write your 2 inequalities and decide whether or not you have a conjunction or a disjunction. Now, whenever you have an absolute value that's less than a number, it's going to be a conjunction. So when I say write your 2 inequalities, what I basically mean is write your inequality here. You're going to have 2 inequality symbols. So you write it just like it is. Okay? Then you also put the same arrow here, and you change the sign of this and put a negative 3 here. And now you solve when you're finished. So bring the 4 over, make it a positive 4. Bring the 4 over, make it a positive 4, and you're left with 1, and then x, and then 7, and there's your answer. If I ask you to graph it, you can graph that very easily. One of your critical values is 1. One of your critical values is 7. Both of them will be open points because there's no equal sign here or here. X is greater than 1. X is less than 7. So there we go. Or if you like to graph it with the squiggly line, you can put your graph just like this. And that would also be your answer. Alright? Okay, moving on to another problem. Alright, let's drop that down to here, and here we go. Okay, step 1, let's isolate the absolute value. Here's your absolute value. We want to get it all by itself, so we have to bring this negative 3 over and make it a positive 3. So now your equation will look like this. 2x plus 1, absolute values greater than or equal to 9. Okay, now step 2. See if you have one of your special 4 exceptions. We don't, because in order to have that, we must have a 0 here. Alright, and we don't, so we're good. Now, moving on. Next, I'm going to do what the directions say, which is to write my 2 inequalities and solve them. Now, in the previous problem, we had an absolute value that was less than, so I knew I had a conjunction. Here we have an absolute value that is greater than, so I'm going to have a disjunction. So I write the equation just like it is. Then I put the word or. Then I write the inequality just like it is again, only I turn the arrow and change the sign. I turn the arrow and I change the sign. So here we go. Let's solve each one of these. Bring your 1 2x is greater than or equal to 8. And then divide both sides by 2, x is greater than or equal to 4. Or bring your 1 over, make it a negative 1. 2x is less than or equal to negative 10. Divide both sides by 2, x is less than or equal to negative 5. And there's your answer. So in the last problem, your answer was a conjunction. In this problem, your answer is a disjunction. If you were to graph, it would look like this. Here's 0. Here's negative 5 over here. Here's negative 4 right here. X is greater than or equal to negative 4. Or x is less than or equal to negative 5. And there we go. Alright, let's move on. Let's try a bunch of these, okay? Here we go. Alright, step 1. Isolate the absolute value. Now here's your absolute value. We have to get rid of a 2 and a negative 3. So first of all, always save the multiplying number for last. Bring your 2 over and make it a negative 2. And you're left with negative 3. Absolute value of 3x minus 9 is greater than 5. Alright. Now, divide both sides by negative 3, and we have, don't forget to flip the arrow, guys. 3x, absolute value of 3x minus 9 is less than negative 5/3. Because I divide this side by negative 3 and they cancel. And I divide this side by negative 3, I'm left with negative 5/3. Alright. Now, guys, we have to check for our 4 exceptions, okay? And you guys know I'm usually pretty good about having an organized video. In fact, I do a pretty good job of that, but there's one thing I should have included in all of these. It can either be 0 or a negative number. And I do apologize for not including that, so it's no big deal. No need to panic. Just go back into your notes and make note of that. I do a lot of this from memory, so sometimes I forget things. I've taught this stuff for years and years. So if the right side is a 0 or a negative number, all of these things apply. Okay, so let's go back over here. Notice I have an absolute value less than a negative number. Do you see that? An absolute value that is less than a negative number. So where do we have that at? Right here, look at that. Absolute value less than a negative number, not less than or equal to. That's a big difference, okay? Please remember that. Alright? It's a big difference. Alright? So if I have this, less than 0, my answer is going to be no solution. Okay? So my answer right away is no solution. Okay? So, pretty simple. There's no work to do or anything because it was one of our special exceptions. Okay, moving on to another problem here. And let's see if that's our last one. Not quite. 2 more to go. Alright. Alright, you can work ahead or watch me. That's up to you. Let's solve this. Now, step 1 is to isolate the absolute value. Okay? So let's bring the negative 4 over and make it a positive 4, and we're left with the absolute value of 5x positive 3 is greater than or equal to 13. Step 2, does this fit any of our exceptions? Well, do I have a 0 here or a negative number? No, I do not. So moving on to step number 3, let's write our inequalities and solve them. Now, I have an absolute value greater than. Let's go back a couple problems. When I have an absolute value greater than, that means I'm going to have a disjunction, okay? So I'm going to have a disjunction, so you write the inequality just like it is. You don't change anything, okay? Except you drop the absolute value bars. And then you write it again, but don't forget you turn the arrow and you change the sign of the number on the right side. And now we solve. Here we go. Bring this 3 over and make it a negative 3, and I'm left with 5x is greater than or equal to 10. Divide both sides by 5, and x is greater than or equal to 2. Over here, I'll put the word or, of course. We have a disjunction. Here we have 5x is less than or equal to, bring your 3 over, make it a negative 3. So negative 16, divide both sides by 5. X x is less than or equal to negative 5 1/3 or 16 over 3 or 5.3. Now that's your answer. You're finished. If I asked you to graph it, you would put a point at negative 5 1/3 and a point at positive 2. They would both be closed. X is greater than 2, so go to the right. X is less than negative 5, so go to the left. And there's the graph. One more and we're finished. Okay, let's solve this. Are you ready? Step 1, isolate the absolute value. We have to get rid of our negative 2 and our positive 18, okay? So first of all, bring your 18 over, make it a negative 18, and you're left with negative 2. Absolute value 3x plus 2. Greater than or equal to negative 8. Alright? Positive 10, negative 18, negative 8. Next, divide both sides by negative 2. Don't forget to turn your arrow, guys. Turn your arrow because you divided by a negative number. Negative divided by a negative is a positive 4. There we go. The absolute value is isolated. Now moving on to step 2. Do we have any of our 4 exceptions? No, we do not. So moving on to step 3. Write your inequalities and solve them. Decide whether you have a conjunction or a disjunction. Well, I have an absolute value less than. Well, Mr. Arrow up here when we started, it was greater than. I know it was. That's why, listen to me, that's why you must follow these steps and do them in order. You don't check to see whether or not you have a conjunction or a disjunction until you get down to step 3. You don't do it at the beginning, okay? So, we're down here. I have an absolute value is less than a number, so it's going to be a conjunction. So I write my 3x plus 2 right in the middle. I bring this down. Then I put the same arrow over here, and I put a negative 4. And now I'm ready to solve it. Let's solve this. Bring your 2 over here and make it a negative 2. And also bring it over here and make it a negative 2. So negative 6. In the middle I'm left with 3x. And then here I'm left with 2. Okay? Now divide everything by 3 to get rid of my 3. And I'm left with negative 6 divided by 3 is negative 2. Here your 3's cancel, leaving you with x. And over here you're left with 2/3. And that is your answer. It's a conjunction, and that's your answer. If I asked you to graph it, you would have negative 2 right here. Positive 2/3 right here. You'd have a point here and a point here. They would both be closed because you have equal signs. And notice it says x is greater than 2. And it's less than 2/3, so you could go like this if you wanted to, that's fine. Or you could just do this if you wanted to. And that would be fine also. This is some tough stuff to learn, guys. It's going to take a lot of work on your part, a lot of memorization, and a lot of studying, but it can be done. You just got to work hard to do it, okay? I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call or email.